Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Waxcast podcast. I am your host, Gavin Wax. Today is, what day is it? It's December 28th, episode 16. And today I'm joined by a friend of mine, someone whose work I admire greatly, Pedro Gonzalez, assistant editor of American Greatness and a contributor at Chronicles Magazine. Pedro, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here, Gavin.
So I wanted to bring you on because I think you're a great thinker on the right, and you write a lot about the populist right, this emerging, maybe not emerging, maybe it's an old movement that's just kind of been given new energy, however you want to describe it, but this new ideological movement that's developing in the United States, body politic, namely this kind of right-wing populism. You've covered a lot of different topics from describing this sort of caudillo sort of aesthetic that a lot of people may be attracted to in Trump or in other right-wing figures, to this working class coalition that's developing. I just want to see what your thoughts are on the future of this movement. Does it have legs? Will it be able to grow politically as a movement as the years go on, now that the Trump presidency seems to be at an end, and it also seems like there may have been many failures during his administration, a lot of which you've detailed. But we'll start off on that macro level question. How do you feel about the future of this movement that you yourself may ascribe to?
It's uncertain. I don't think anything is granted, especially not now. And I think that the biggest vulnerability to this nascent movement comes from within. It's not anything that you're going to see from the Democrats or the left or something like that, even though I think that these terms as descriptors of enemies are increasingly outdated, because we say the left. I think there are a lot of people who identify as conservatives who would, I think, be able to neatly be put into a column that isn't so dissimilar from the left. But I think that's a digression. Ultimately, like I said, I think that the biggest threat to this emerging movement is from within. It's a lack of self-understanding. What does the movement represent? Where does it want to go? What are its fundamental ideas? And how do we get to where we want to go in terms of governance? I know the answer to this, but these are the questions that we're currently struggling with. Are we a limited government movement? Well, I think the answer is no, at least for people like me that I think have a better understanding of where we want to go and how we're going to get there. No, we are not a limited government movement. We're also not a movement that accepts things like free trade and corporate policies as a positive good. That's definitely not two planks of this movement. And I think another obvious one is immigration. We are absolutely an immigration restrictionist movement. So I think these are the basic kind of givens for this movement, but there's still a lot of, like I said, a lack of self-understanding and especially execution. How do we
Now,
get to be?
do you think the Republican Party in its current form could ever be changed from the inside to fully accept and adapt to these policy positions that you just outlined, or is it too far gone? Because many have pointed out, if you look at the ideological quadrants, there's no real party in the U.S. that really represents. I believe it's that upper right quadrant where it's kind of mixing what you're describing in terms of economic nationalism with conservative social views, etc.
Yeah, the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is no. I don't see the Republican Party as a real vehicle for this movement. I think that the Republican Party is still, unless something happens, and I would love to be wrong. I'm very much a pessimist. So it's always nice to be wrong when you have very low expectations for things ever turning out differently. But I think the Republican Party as it exists is a kind of vehicle for taking populist currents and assimilating them into the establishment, and thus neutralizing them and rendering them kind of harmless. And I think you saw this with Trump, who ran as an anti-establishment figure, but ultimately, when we look back on Trump's tenure, we see that Mitch McConnell got everything he wanted.
Right.
And basically, like the Paul Ryan corner of the Republican Party got everything that they wanted. So starts off as a populist, as a disruptor, and ends up pretty much defanged and harmless. And I think that the Republican Party This is the one thing that it's very good at. It excels at assimilating these disruptive populist currents and making them harmless. Like I said, I think you also saw this with Reagan. So that's why, for me, it was frustrating, but it wasn't really too surprising to see Trump in many ways kind of go the same way as Reagan.
So you don't
Someone
think
could,
that Trump moved the Overton window at all? Because I know you said you're a pessimist and you're
yes,
describing this
yes.
assimilation of policy. Do you think the Republican Party, in some ways, obviously, I tend to agree with you that the Paul Ryan and the Mitch McConnell wing got everything they wanted, but don't you think something, quote unquote, trickled down, if we can even use that phrase, into the sort of the corpus of the party, and that it is part of it going forward in a good way?
As far no, still I think as far as the party is concerned, it's just its funding structure and its institutional structure just won't let it happen on anything but a superficial level or a very very limited level. I think that's just the reality. But I do think that the most important aspect of the Trump movement, if we can properly understand it and capitalize on this, is, as you said, ideas that were once considered fringe and could not be discussed in the mainstream are now very much mainstream. We're now openly having debates over not just illegal immigration being something that is bad and should be tamped down on, but also legal immigration, whether independent of Trump's successes and failures on these specific policy issues. He still made it so that we could have the conversation. And of course, there's a rebuttal in that, but nevertheless, I think that's the most important aspect of the Trump era is that, as you said, the Overton window kind of moved on a lot of these things, and now they've been brought to light.
Do you have faith in the political process at large as a vehicle to move these ideas forward, or are you just largely, dismissive of it and pessimistic in general? I mean, even at the local or state level.
No, I think that politics still can be a vehicle for change, and I think that I'm not a cynic. Uh, there's a difference between a pessimist and a cynic, and so I don't think that it's completely futile. I think that it still can be a vehicle for change, and I think that actually what's more important now than ever is organizing on the local and state level, not investing all of our money and effort and emotional investments in what happens in DC, what
Right.
happens in the White House. I think that's a huge mistake, and in fact, I think it can be a lethal mistake because if you're only if all of your efforts are focused on what's happening in DC, you're missing what's happening on the local and state level. And in other words, you're missing that your city council has been taken over by a bunch of leftists who want to like defund the police or something because you're looking at DC instead of what's going on in your hometown. So I actually think that the local and state level are more important now than ever.
Now, as far as Trump's political movement goes, I mean, there were some interesting developments, maybe in terms of demographics, and I think you've touched on a bit, particularly with like the Hispanic vote. Do you think that there is hope for this kind of new form of populism, this right-wing populism, in, say, kind of a broad, working class coalition that crosses racial lines, that crosses ethnic lines? Do you think that that's something that is actually worth pursuing and is a great counter to the establishment's narrative of pandering, and always getting the same results, which is basically nothing? How do you view that?
I think that there is broad appeal for a lot of these issues that were outlined at the beginning of our talk, but I think that at bottom, this is always going to be a largely white coalition. It's just a fact. Most of the people that um, support the policies that we've outlined, the things that we believe in, happen to be white. Uh, a mixture of white working class people. By working class, I don't just mean blue collar. I also mean white, which are like professional things like IT. I guess is probably the best example. IT workers, they to me, they in terms of attitude and psychology even they strike me as blue collar like they're very much like have this blue collar attitude of a kind they've really undergone a kind of proletarization.
Great
So I
word.
think right, which I probably butchered it, but so when I say working class, the point is that I don't I mean blue, white, and pink. Pink is like service jobs, so that's it's a very expansive term. So like I said, white working class and also white moderates, people who are not really on board with the GOP's hardcore, let's call it fiscal conservatism. Although it's kind of a silly it's silly that we even call it that because it's really fiscal conservatism for us, but then just promiscuous spending for like Raytheon, like for the defense industry.
Pakistani transgender studies, which
Right.
is very
Yeah.
important.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a
So
huge
I
natural
think
constituency for that, of course.
yeah. Right. Yeah. And so I think that I think that's ultimately my point is that this is always going to be a largely white working class movement. That's not to say obviously that there's not room for. I mean, I'm obviously Hispanic, and
Shut up.
obviously
Shut
there's
up.
room for us,
Shut
right?
up. Shut
Yeah,
up.
yeah. So
I
there's
had no
room for
idea.
us.
Anyway, sorry.
No, it's okay. I get accused of being like a crypto white.
You got to
Uh,
show them the photo, and
really,
you have to show them the photo. And you have the
yeah.
mustache. Then that'll
Birth
shut everyone up.
certificate.
Yeah.
Yeah, birth certificate and mustache is proof. No. But I think it's important to raise this point because it seems to make people uncomfortable when you point that out. It's like, look, yeah, there's going to be blacks and Asians and Hispanics and stuff in this coalition, but at the end of the day, it's going to be mostly white. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then you should probably do some soul searching as
Right.
to why that makes you just so reflexively kind of like, ooh, we need to make this movement less white. It's like that.
After
That is
all,
actually to me that's a really weird.
it is. No, and after all, the leftists are the left created this sort of white voting bloc that never really existed before. I mean, I think the last 20 years or so have really solidified a white voting bloc that never really existed before. I mean, maybe because demographics have changed and it's not as solid of a majority as it once was. But the left is certainly, I mean, maybe you disagree, maybe you don't, maybe you agree, but they've certainly divided this country to a point where whites are a voting bloc and they should be discussed as such.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think, well, I know it's true. Every group has legitimate interests,
Yeah.
and it seems pretty clear and obvious to me that if you have lumped all of whites together into a group and assigned or ascribed to them basically all of the evils of American history, and that they deserve to be basically dispossessed and plowed under, and kind of like economically and culturally destroyed, they're going to start voting as a bloc, and that shouldn't surprise you because it's in their interest to not want those things to happen to them, just like it would be in the interest of any group to not want those things to happen to them.
Yeah.
And they just happen to be the only group that's not allowed to acknowledge these things, even though other people acknowledge them as good things, and B, they're certainly not allowed to even consider voting as a bloc with interests.
And do you think, in part, maybe the prosperity of our country, and if even if a movement were to take hold, this is really like theoretical here, but do you think that it's sort of like that meme where it shows, hard times create strong men create good times, and then great times create weak men, and the whole cycle repeats? Do you think sort of the prosperity that our nation has, over the generations, been exposed to, and what we may achieve again in the future is always going to sort of lead to this populist right-wing movement being self-defeating? Because it seems when you start to see the income levels rise, the rising levels of education, suburbanization, whatever it is, it starts to drift voters, including white voters, away from sort of a right-wing message more into this sort of bourgeoisie liberalism.
I'm not sure. I mean, that's a good point you raised, but I think that we're actually seeing that people want something more than just these data points about prosperity and how TVs are more affordable now than ever. And I think you see this because conservatives like the people at National Review, like Jonah Goldberg, they constantly will pull out these data points. Fewer people are dying now than ever thanks to advances in medical technology. You can afford a pair of blue jeans more easily than your ancestors could, or so, like kind of trite things like that. And of course, they always deploy these data points, these talking points, with a kind of like um, confusion. Like, well, why is everyone so upset? Like, why did anyone support the candidacy of Donald Trump? We
Right.
have it so much better than our ancestors. Our material conditions are so much better. Uh, so why are people upset? And so I think for them it's confusing, but for me it's not, because humans are not just cogs in a machine. They want more than just uh, economic, I guess. They want to know that life is more than just material goods. You know, uh, that it's not just TVs and cheap stuff from China. And just talking about this is kind of difficult because you quickly start talking about things that are abstract. It kind of flirts into kind of a religious conversation, right?
Right.
Like, what is the purpose of being human? And these are questions that conservatism can't really answer because it addresses everything from, or attempts to address everything from an economic perspective. That man is at bottom an economic man.
Or society is divided
satisfied.
at the individual, not the family, etc.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a fundamental problem with conservatism, is it tries to reduce everything to data points,
Modern
and to kind
conservatism.
of like, what? Yeah, contemporary conservatism. Like, why are you crying? Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know. And of course, it's not working. Uh, so yeah.
And what's ironic about them bringing up these factoids about maybe purchasing power, costs of goods, and all this other stuff. A lot of the times, it's very much cherry picked because you could find plenty of data that shows we're actually worse off compared to many of our ancestors in terms of our purchasing power and in terms of where we are in terms of wealth. I mean, you need more than 2 incomes now just to support a family in most of the country. That's certainly a regression from generations past. So it's not even consistent in terms of what the Goldbergs of the world will bring up. But I also wanted to touch on something that you brought up earlier in terms of looking at the left, kind of the left as a sort of monolith, that they're all sort of this singular group, when really they're not. I mean, that's a mistake on my part. I mean, it's definitely easier just to describe them in that way, but it's certainly not necessarily accurate. There is an emerging kind of analogous left-wing populist movement within the Democratic Party, for example, that may share some underlining similarities with some on the right-wing populist movement, including some of the direct assistance, relief bills, things like that. But there's also just a lot of differences historically. I know you've pointed out recently, I believe on Twitter, you were kind of making fun of the modern woke left compared to, say, the Soviet left, which was very much traditional in many ways and embraced things like some tenets of social conservatism, masculinity, etc. And the modern left has just perverted everything, and it's kind of like this postmodernist, just disgusting hellhole of every sort of hedonistic and morally relativist viewpoints all mashed together in one. I mean, what do you say about that change in the left?
Well, this is sort of perennial problem that we try to find these people who their economic views are what we would traditionally classify as left wing, right? So these are ironically, these are people that would favor like protectionism and immigration restrictionism. These are people who would favor policies that the Trump movement, at least initially, began identifying with, right? Like rolling back our preconceived notions about free trade and embracing things like tariffs and protectionism. So we try to look for these people on the left, but they're not easy to find. And I think it's because increasingly, to be left wing at all, you have to subscribe to all these kind of crazy social views. And so what happens, I think, is that these people either just end up becoming independents, maybe they just morph into independents or self-described moderates, or they join the populist right, or I don't know, maybe they lay low and just kind of pay lip service to these crazy social views, like on race and gender and stuff like that.
But you're talking about a lot of people there with that definition. That's a huge chunk of the country that may have either moderate or kind of just standard social views, but economically they could be described as sort of left wing or nationalist.
Yeah, frankly, I think that's most of the. I think that there are far more people like that have, let's say, socially conservative or like socially moderate views.
Yeah, maybe they're pro-choice, or they don't really care, or they don't care about stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can find a lot more of those people, and that also have like economically moderate views than you can of any other block. I think there was a survey that was done in 2015 by Michael Lynn's colleague at the New America Foundation. And what they found was the single largest in 2015, the single largest constituency in the United States was what they describe as populist. And these are people who favor either decreasing immigration levels or keeping them the same, and for Social Security spending, either keeping it the same or increasing it. And they found that block constituted 40% of the American electorate. And actually the smallest blocks were business conservatives, so like the Paul Ryan types.
Right, the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, basically like libertarians and business conservatives were the two smallest groups, but because they have all of the money and all of the institutional resources, they're the ones that will typically get their way in terms of policy. They're also the ones that are the loudest because they have the most money. But they're interestingly, they are the smallest block, which means that their ideas are only kept alive through tons of money and kind of like these astroturfed organizations like TPUSA. So,
Well, well, would you support, say, maybe a more left-wing view of having, many of these campaigns be publicly financed and, rejecting a lot of capital and funding that comes from, outside groups? A campaign finance reform, do you think that should become a plank of the populist right in order to isolate and sort of push out the donor class, so to speak, which is negatively impacting the party?
yeah, I'm open to it. At this point, I'm open to pretty much throwing the kitchen sink at money in politics because I think that if you've been paying attention, it's become painfully clear that the biggest threat to a better future, to the world that we want to build, it's not China, it's not Russia, uh, it's not it's not. I wouldn't even say it's like Antifa or like Black Lives Matter. It's the core. It's this fused corporate government leviathan that works in unison to push all of these insane policies on people. And I think a lot of it comes down to, or I should say, that a lot of what we want to accomplish on the populist right, we'll call it, uh, begins with taking on these entities, uh, which for contemporary conservatism is a kind of like no go. Like you don't attack big business, like you don't go after the donors, you don't make it illegal for people like George Soros to finance movements in the United States. Like Hungary's done that. They have these stop Soros laws. Like you don't do any of that because money's good, and you have to kind of turn a
You have
blind
to
eye to it.
embrace it. You have to embrace it all.
Right. No, not for me, and not for the. I think this emergent movement. I think there's a, uh, and going back to your point about the left, about finding these allies on the left. I'm hoping that that this happens more organically as a result of that, as a result of people that are identifiably populist right starting to say things like what I'm saying. It makes them feel like maybe there's an authentic coalition that can be created.
Before we get into the next topic, I do want to jump into some details about the Trump administration and your favorite real estate developer in New York, who's not Donald Trump, starts with Kushner. But before we get into that, I want to talk more about the left because there is some other analogies you could maybe draw here. You see on the right, there's this sort of Chamber of Commerce sort of faction that doesn't really have a large grassroots support, but it's being propped up by money, it's being propped up by the establishment, the powers that be, et cetera, et cetera. On the left, would you also describe maybe within their ranks, this sort of this woke SJWism? Do you think that's organic? Do you think this sort of the he, the pronoun in bio people, the everyone's gender fluid, all these sort of social, just disgusting social constructs that they've propped up and try to normalize? Do you think that is actually the organic left, or do you think that's actually being propped up by powers that be, or is the real power that be on the left that sort of similar neoliberal uni party that sort of also dominates the GOP? That was a bit of a jumbled question, but hopefully you can decipher it.
Well, I mean, the problem is jumbled, right? It's really difficult to know uh, what what the disconnect is, or at least I should back up and say, you want to believe that the most insane and radical tendencies of the left is not at all representative of a good part of the country, and that instead it's kind of just this really vocal, insane minority that just happens to kind of become the face of these neoliberal institutions that are kind of trying to rehabilitate their image, right? So now we bomb Yemen, Pakistanis or something with drones that have like LGBTQ flags on them, which makes it more tolerable. We do that, right? So I think that that's definitely part of it, is just taking advantage of the most absurd tendencies on the left and using that to rehabilitate a lot of these institutions that need to die and that we need to get rid of, and that it's not representative of, let's say, a good part of the country. Um, but I think that it is true enough that uh, we're the United States is just kind of going in a left wing direction on a lot of issues socially. It's just I think it's just a matter of demographics and kind of like the zeitgeist. So this is definitely an uphill battle in terms of turning these things around and fighting these trends.
I agree it's demographics, but would you also not say that I mean, obviously, I know you would say it, but the institutions of higher learning, academia,
No,
are a big part of this. And how would a regime that everything the left claims Trump was, let's assume it really was that authoritarian regime that they claim it would be, how would they tackle what goes on the campuses, in these classrooms? Because they're basically giant indoctrination centers, and they're being supported by the mass media, big tech, etc. And I mean, we could shut off immigration tomorrow, but maybe the pessimist in me would argue wouldn't matter, because they would still just convert your entire, entire new generation. Doesn't matter what the parents believe. It doesn't matter what the parents instill. They'll come out of these schools. They'll hate mom and dad, and they'll want to go burn down Seattle.
yeah, no, I think that shutting off immigration would definitely help, but I think you make a good point that ultimately this problem is it's something inherent in America. There's something about our institutions now that just kind of create a bad human product. And so for my part, I'm all for uh, ending student loan debt and connecting that to ending the practice of student lending, so that there are fewer people in schools, because I think that's better for the country. And I'm also for having, like, basically forcing universities to uh, putting them on the hook through their endowments for student loan debt, which would of course kill a lot of universities, which I also think would be better for the country. I'm for like stripping a lot of institutions of their tax exempt status. I'm absolutely for going scorched earth on a lot of these institutions that either indoctrinate people to think a certain way, um, which is I think kind of funny, because it's true that they are indoctrination centers, but they're also massively parasitic institutions in that most of the money that goes into them just goes into like administrative and bureaucratic stuff.
Yeah.
There's actually very little learning that goes on.
Yep.
So that's just another reason, in my view, that they don't deserve to exist anymore.
That's that's your fiscal conservative inner conscience speaking out.
Right. Well, it's more of just like an anger at the fact that that is actually a thing. That there are these like Office of Diversity and Inclusion, where that people make tons of money working there, and their whole job is just to basically kind of oversee this Orwellian process of whatever diversity and inclusion entails at a university. Or like the bias response teams, which it's like a SWAT team for like tolerance. Like it's just it all gets really crazy. But the point is that we're funding all of this, we're paying
Yeah.
for all of this, and we shouldn't. And if that is this is all setting aside the fact that universities are also helping themselves to the immigration racket. Like they take advantage of things like OPT and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So no, I'm all for nuking a lot of these institutions and attacking them where it hurts, which is in their wallets.
Support all that. That's a great policy platform there. But now shifting gears a bit, you've also been commenting a lot as of late on the Trump administration, its failures, particularly with personnel and how they've effectuated policy or lack thereof. And, I, like many, I do support Trump. I do think he was overall a great president. I mean, I liked his rhetoric in many cases a lot more than what ended up being a lot of his policy. But you sort of focus in a lot on, maybe some could describe it as the court intrigue within the White House, and how certain actors and certain individuals have really sort of gutted this America First movement that propelled him to the White House to begin with. Do you want to touch on that and your favorite real estate developer in New York?
Yeah, Kushner. I don't think anyone is more responsible for the disconnect between what Trump campaigned on and what we got from Trump than Jared Kushner. But ultimately, this goes back to Trump, who delegated a lot of this to Kushner, who trusted him with the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, Kushner effectively became something like a prime minister in the White House. And I think a lot of people are struggling to accept this, and which I can understand. It's hard to wrap your mind around this, right? How did Trump, who I think at least initially people perceived as a kind of like, it's like a really alpha guy, like type A, like the you're fired guy, all of that's very not true. Trump actually, apparently he hates firing people. He rarely does it. Um, and he pretty much caves into what, like, if Ivanka wants something, and by extension, if Kushner wants something, like they get it. And interestingly, you've also seen this dynamic play out with Congress. Like I said at the beginning, Mitch McConnell got pretty much everything he wanted out of Trump. So at the end of the day, I do obviously have a lot of hate for Jared Kushner, but it's Trump who empowered him to do these things. So I think we're only now starting to kind of scratch the surface of to what extent Kushner was kind of directly overseeing this process of disconnecting 2016 and the mandate of 2016 from the actual administration. But I think as time goes on, people are going to come to grips with this and see that how bad and how extensive his influence was.
Now, to play devil's advocate, a lot of people may, push back on you and say, well, the first 4 years, there wasn't a lot of institutional knowledge. Trump didn't really know how to navigate DC. He just went with people he could trust, which was his family. And there were bad personnel decisions that held him back. The Russia investigation held him back. And that's why the first 4 years we may not have seen nearly as much on the policy front as we would have liked. But that's why the next term, the other 4 years, would have been so crucial in effectuating this America First agenda. Do you buy that? Is it partially true, completely BS? What would you say to that?
Well, I was one of the people who was defending Trump pretty vehemently for most of his presidency, right? I was kind of overlooking these things and trying to be the person that would find the good and the bad. But I eventually came to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. It was just so apparent that Trump was aware of a lot of the things that was happening, or if he wasn't aware, it was. I mean, what's the better answer? Trump is ignorant of what's happening under his nose, or he's so incompetent that it happened anyway. There's both of these conclusions are bad. But as far as the points you brought up, Trump actually got a lot of things done while he was being investigated. Tax cuts, which no one asked for, criminal justice reform, which no one voted for in 2016. So he actually got these two huge things up that have come to define his presidency: tax cuts and CJR. Those are two of the things that Kushner was most actively involved in. So in other words, two of Trump's biggest accomplishments are actually two of Kushner's biggest things that he pushed. And in terms of personnel, the administration actively chased out some of its best people, some of its most ideologically America First people. Yet remember, you had Michael, I don't remember in what order exactly. They all either resigned or left, but you had Bannon, Michael Anton, and Sepp Gorka. Say what you want about those three, they were at least ideologically aligned with America First, right? And they were all among the first people to leave. And I think it was even Gorka who said when he left that there are forces that are hostile to the America First agenda that are ascendant in the White House. And it's oddly enough, Gorka kind of like stopped talking about that. I don't know why. I'm not insinuating anything, by the way, but it was just weird to me that he kind of dropped that because it's true. And there was actually a lot of truth to that. And it's evident now that Gorka wasn't just saying something in a state of bitterness. It was actually very, very true what he said. And again, a lot of people don't really, I think, understand this right now, but it kind of became a rule where the closer you got to the president, the worse you are as a person, or the closer you got to Trump, the least likely you were to be kind of like a pro-America First. And I think one of the best examples of this, besides Jared Kushner, is Brooke Rollins, who became the head of the Domestic Policy Council, which is the principal forum for considering and reviewing domestic policy. And she's running it, right? Brooke Rollins is a literal Koch Industries shill. Before she came to the White House, she worked for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a kind of a vehicle for Koch Industries to push whatever policies they want from immigration to like environmental stuff. And so Rollins went from TPF to working at the Office of American Innovation for Jared Kushner, and then from there she became the head of the DPC. And now she's running like Trump's post-White House political platform with an eye to maybe running him in 2024. And she's basically an empty suit in the sense that she just does whatever her donors, the Kochs, tell her to do. And she's basically charged with carrying on the America First agenda. So I think that's a really good example of this problem of like the closer you are to the president, the worse you are.
Is there anyone in the political arena today that you think could, carry the torch forward after Trump? I mean, obviously some people would say he'll run again in 2024. He'll probably, do great. But from an ideological standpoint and from someone who has at least some measure of feasibility to actually become president, is there anyone out there that you know of that could really be the person to carry this forward?
No, I don't really have a lot of faith in Josh Hawley and I'm kind of ambivalent about Tom Cotton. I really just think that a lot of the people in the GOP are ultimately captive to the GOP. There's always going to be that limit, right? Like one of the things that people are talking about now on the populist right, for however long we want to use that term, because I'm almost starting to not want to use the term populist because it seems like even that kind of got co-opted, but that's a different talking point, different thing to discuss. But one of the things that we're talking about right now is ending foreign aid. I think the debate over the coronavirus relief bill really made that acute for a lot of people. The fact that, like you mentioned in the beginning, Pakistan was getting millions of dollars for like gender studies, and you had countries from like the Sudan to the UK to Israel to a bunch of different countries that were getting hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And why? Why
billions,
is that?
Billions.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so you had a ton of people that were just suddenly realized like this is insane. We shouldn't be giving any foreign countries any money. And so you have to ask yourself, would Tom Cotton, who's kind of a hawk, I think, and would Josh Hawley, I think Josh Hawley more so, but would Tom Cotton be on board with zero foreign aid? I don't think so. And I'm not sure about Josh Hawley either. I think maybe more so, but I think Hawley's weakness, as far as I can tell, is like social issues. He was one of the first people to give like a big kind of emotional eulogy for George Floyd and immediately kind of kowtow to BLM when that whole thing first happened.
Mm.
So I think that there's just not, this is what's so frustrating about this. So, go ahead.
No one has the backbone. I mean, Trump has his issues, and it may come from an administrative perspective, but there are elements of Trump that are hard to replicate with many others. He does have this sort of brashness, this machismo, this caudillo thing to him that he's able to sort of brush off a lot of pressures that a Hawley or maybe a Cotton would face.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think this is what's so frustrating about Trump, right? Is that he seemed like the perfect package. He was this guy that was saying all of the right things about all of the right issues in 2016. And to boot, he also had the charisma and seemingly the kind of like personality type to sort of dominate people and obstacles in his way to get these things done. And it's frustrating because that's not the reality of Donald Trump. He's just not and I wrote an article about the whole Cadillissimo thing and how that I think was part of his appeal for like minority men, basically. Specifically, I wrote about Black men and Hispanic men. But if you read my article about this, I was really careful about the words I chose, and I think the term I use is put on. Like Trump has this strong man put on, where on the surface, this is what he looks like, this kind of this caudillo, right? This strong man, but it's ultimately just a put on. Like he's just not as tough as he sounds. And like the Rubicon Don meme is just a meme. He's not Caesar.
Yeah, unfortunately,
Frustrating, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I would love our Rubicon moment, but do you think, with kind of to tie into a bit of this, do you think there is this emerging populist ink that many people, they throw that term around on Twitter, to sort of replicate what Con Inc. is, this Beltway think tank, kind of go along to get along. They say the right things, but they end up just becoming just as bad as the swamp that they inhabit. Do you think we're starting to see the beginnings of that as this movement, as you kind of described earlier, is assimilated into the party infrastructure? It'll be assimilated into the Beltway infrastructure, and you'll have sort of, there will be some money to back it up, but it'll always be tempered by the money that is giving it to them, thus creating Populist Inc.
Yes, it already exists. I think it probably realistically sprang up a year, maybe before 2020, I guess is what I'll say. But it's really kind of on steroids now. And ultimately, the reason we call it Populism Inc. is because it's not at all different from Conservatism Inc. It's really the same kind of grift. Like, give us money and we'll save the republic, but that's not actually what they're doing. And I think actually one of the best examples of Populism Inc. is this new think tank that Brooke Rollins is going to be at the head at. Because again, the idea is she's going to advance the MAGA agenda with Trump, right, after he leaves the White House. So yeah, I mean, it's stupid and it's fake and all that, and that's true enough. But think about what this actually means in terms of resources. So you have these like normie people that are well-intentioned, and they want to help, right? They want to do something after Trump leaves the White House. So where are they going to invest resources, by which I mean money? They're probably going to give it to organizations where people like Brooke Rollins are, because they can claim to have that kind of institutional backing of the Trump brand, right? Like, I worked in the White House for Trump. Trump trusted me to run the DPC. Like, so you should give your money to me and not to these like upstart, actual small grassroots organizations that pop up to basically do what Trump didn't do, and to kind of clear off the dross and recover what America First is as a real concept. Those organizations, and they exist, they're going to basically get, I think, passed up on. And instead, a lot of the resources and time and emotional investment is going to go to these Populist Inc. organizations, like the one that Brooke, I don't know if it has a name yet, but whatever Brooke Rollins is going to be running, like, that's where it's going to go. And she's going to, her and her cronies are going to, they're going to tour the country, and they're going to talk about how they're advancing the ideas of 2016. So you should give them your money. Don't give them to these crazy upstarts, these fringe outfits that don't get anything done.
It's a good point. Another depressing point, but it's very much true. Let's end it on a good note. Where can the Waxcast viewers and listeners follow Mr. Gonzalez and all his writings and his thoughts and his great, very optimistic viewpoints?
I'm sorry. It's
great. I love it.
So you can follow me at my newsletter. It's contra.substack.com. Contra, like anti-communist guerrillas, or Iran Contra. Contra.substack.com. And so whenever I write something or do an interview, I'll usually put it in there and send out to my huge list of subscribers. No, it's not that big, but it's getting bigger, my list of subscribers. I'll put it there, and then I also have links to all of my social media accounts on my newsletter.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you. This is great. I mean, we could have talked for a few hours, but I definitely want to have you back on the Waxcast soon. And everyone who is listening, stay tuned. We're going to be having a very busy week full of a ton of new episodes to make up for the last week of downtime. So stay tuned to the Waxcast, waxcastpodcast.com. Stay tuned for more. And thank you very much.
Yeah.